So good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Base University panel discussion on Union Budget 2021-22. Dr. Rao would be trying to joining. In the meantime, let me introduce the panelists. It's my pleasure to introduce a very distinguished panel for this discussion. Although we are very well aware that the budget is presented some more than 2 weeks back, our purpose here is to take a little broad view of the budget in the context of changing macro, fiscal, monetary, and financial issues. And for this, we have an excellent panel, and it's my privilege to briefly introduce, for the sake of some of our young students who are actually participating in this discussion. We'll be joined by Professor M. Govinda Rao, one of the topmost public finance specialists in the country. He was a member of the 14th Finance Commission, former director of NIPFP and ISEC Bangalore. He was a member of Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, a fellow of Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies, Australian National University. He served in various government committees, such as the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, High-Level Committee on Universalizing Healthcare, High-Level Committee on Efficient Management of Public Expenditures, Advisory Committee of Finance Ministers on G20 matters, and he has chaired 2 important committees for implementation of value-added tax and also the tax on services. Dr. Rao's research include fiscal decentralization and federalism, state and local finances, tax policy and reforms, public expenditure management, among many other issues. Above all, he has been an inspiration to many young students and faculty members, and he has mentored a generation of researchers in the field of public finance and policy. And I'm proud to say that I'm one of those who have benefited immensely from Dr. Rao's research and guidance. I hope Dr. Rao will be able to listen to him today. Now I have Dr. Niranjan Radhajaksha, who is presently Research Director and Senior Fellow at IDFC Institute. He provides direction to the Institute's research programs. His research institutes include macroeconomics, political economy, and economic history. He was Executive Director of MINT. Those who read MINT regularly, you know that there is a special column called CAFE Economics. And I think that's a very popular column in the MINT even today. Before joining MINT, he was deputy editor of Business World. He was awarded the Jefferson Fellowship by the East-West Center in 1998. He received prestigious awards like Ramnath Goenka Award for Excellence in Journalism in 2012 and B.R. Shenoy Award for Economics in 2017. He is a member of the Academic Advisory Board of the newly instituted Meghnad Desai Academy of Economics and the Board of Trustees of Center for Civil Society. He was also a member of the Advisory Committee on the 5th volume of the Official History of the Reserve Bank of India. I think those who want to understand Reserve Bank history, I think they need to read this history. And Dr. Niranjan was part of that Advisory Committee. He has completed his PhD from Mumbai School of Economics and Public Policy, and I'm very grateful to him for agreeing to be part of this discussion. Welcome, Niranjan, for this meeting. Now I'd like to introduce my good friend, Shamika Ravi. She is currently non-resident senior fellow of the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institute, Washington. She was a former director of research at Brookings India and led the development economics vertical in the center. She's a visiting professor of economics at the Indian School of Business. She was also a member of Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. She is affiliated with the Financial Access Initiative of New York University, and her research work has been featured and cited by BBC, The Guardian, the Financial Times, and most of the national and regional newspapers and magazines in India. And again, she is very popular for the past 1 year. She has been doing this analysis on COVID-19. And I think those who follow her on Twitter, I'm sure they'll certainly appreciate her contribution to our understanding on COVID-19 trends across the states, not just at India. Now we have Dr. Abik Barua from the financial market side. Dr. Barwa is the Chief Economist and Senior Vice President of HDFC Bank, one of the largest, rather the largest private bank in the country now. And he has been in the financial sector for 17 years. And he has been with CRISIL, Merrill Lynch, and the Economic Times. His previous assignment was as Chief Economist, ABN AMRO Bank. A very familiar face in the media, and his views on financial and banking sector is very widely respected, and I'm glad that he has accepted our invitation to be part of this panel. Last but not least, we have Dinesh Narayan, who is going to moderate this session, a very good friend of mine for the past 2 decades. He is currently serving as Senior Assistant Editor at Economic Times. Before that, he was with the Forbes, Business World, Times of India, the Hindu Business Line, and he's been award-winning journalist, and his recent book is on the RSS and the making of deep nation. Thank you, Dinesh, for joining this discussion. I also like to welcome my students, very bright students that we have at the university, and also for participants from other different institutions. I could see people from RBI and other agencies are also participating. I welcome all of you. Before I leave the session to Dinesh, I would request the participants, if at all you have any questions or queries, to put it in the chat box. I think at the end of in the Q&A session, Dinesh will help to raise those issues for the panelists. Now I request Dinesh to take over the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bhanumurthy. It's a privilege to be here today.
Now,
thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Rao is here. I don't know. Can we hear him? I don't know.
I still can't.
Yeah, I think you can go ahead, Dinesh.
All right.
I'll call him.
Thank you for inviting me and putting together this stellar panel. I'm glad this is not an international conference, so we don't need other permissions and all that. But it is my privilege to be here amidst people whom I really look up to. Professor Rao and Dr. Niranjan are people whom I often call to get an understanding of complex policy issues. I follow very closely Professor Shamika and Abhik's work. We are having this discussion in the backdrop of the Economic Survey, Union Budget, the report of the 15th Finance Commission, and the RBI's Monetary Policy Review. And all of them are coming in the larger background of the COVID pandemic, which is so rudely interrupted life itself. A lot of the budget numbers have been discussed and scrutinized threadbare in the public domain. So what we would attempt to focus is on the larger picture of the government's intent and strategy to expand, the stated aim of expanding the economy to a 5 trillion one on its own steam, that is Atmanirbhar, and the viability and feasibility of the strategies. Can this moment be compared to, say, a 1991 or to some extent 2001, when two very different governments operating in very different circumstances had broken from custom, so to say? And whether the measures taken not only in this budget, but over the past 1 year, what Finance Secretary Ajay Bhushan Pandey calls it as several mini budgets, whether these would live up to the goals articulated by the Prime Minister himself. I was going to start with Professor Rao, but since Professor Rao his audio is not available yet, I'm going to ask Professor Shamika. She has done a deep dive into the language of budget speeches itself and compared it to those delivered over the past 50 years. And she has some insights, and I think Professor Shamika says that the most transformative idea of the budget is privatization and sale of public assets. Professor Shamika.
Thank you, Dinesh, and thank you, Bhanu, for this invitation. I'm very happy to be part of this, and my very, very broad support and gratitude to Base University. I wish you all the best. Let me first start out, and I'm glad that both Bhanu and Dinesh have focused, repeatedly said we are going to talk about the budget from a broad perspective. And I think it's important because what you're going to hear from a microeconomist about the budget is definitely not a standard way in which budgets have been analyzed. But I do think this year's budget does stand out. For all of us who have been following Indian economy for the last few decades, we know that this is an often repeated phrase that it is said that desperate times call for desperate measures. And in that sense, the annual, the budget speech, Finance Minister Sitaraman definitely reflects this this year in no uncertain terms. In an economy that has been ravished by COVID-19 pandemic, the government's approach to this predicament is to spend heavily on infrastructure, including health, financed in the short term by borrowing, but over the longer run through privatization and disinvestment of public assets. Now, annual budget announcements by India's central governments are an important because, and many people have asked me this even globally, that why is it that annual budgets in India are a much bigger affair than they are in perhaps other parts of the world, definitely other OECD markets, but even in terms of other emerging markets. And that is because, the government remains such a significant player in our economy that it's a very important indication of future taxation, trade, health, education, financial sector policies, etc. So the budget speech and the budget itself is a very important episode for all of us in India. Now, what makes this particular year's budget unique for the Modi government is that it has received relatively widespread praise. Typically, there is a division and there is a considerable pushback, but this year, I think more than before, there has been widespread praise from across the policy world, media and academia, which has been rather critical on many other fronts.
I have joined from another computer. Hello? 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 Are you able to hear me?
Yes, Professor Govindrao, we can hear you.
Okay.
Please continue, Professor Shamika. I will
Right.
Professor Rao after this.
Now, this year's budget speech, there is something that distinguishes this year's budget from the history of budget speeches. And the reason I say this is because, and I think it is best said from a simple slide such as this. And really, I don't have to show slides to you, but I do want you to see that, and I hope everyone can see this. Dinesh, is this visible?
Not right now. I'm not able to see it. Is anybody else able to see it? I hope it's not only a problem at my end.
No, not at Shamika.
Can you see this?
No,
we are not able to see. Yeah.
Okay. So let me just talk you through what I have done. And this is a paper that is coming out today at Brookings. It's a short paper which really does a big data analysis because we have the sort of the econometric capability and statistical packages that can help us do this. We have looked at the word frequency of union budgets over the last 50 years. And what will really surprise you is that in this year's budget, we have had the least reference to the word growth. And I think it is because it is implicit in, in terms of everyone's understanding and expectation that nearly all the measures that have been announced and the fundamental shift in the way we are looking at the national budget, growth is the implicit. But what is equally, I think, surprising is the fact that there is no mention of inflation at all, which does stand out, particularly because we have borrowing as a short-term strategy, and the fact that we have announced, the finance minister has announced a very large expansion in infrastructure spending. In fact, the word infrastructure has been mentioned in this year's budget 57 times, which is a record in itself. But I think the words do reflect the deeper intent of the government. And so, announcement of such a large infrastructure expansion against no mention of inflation, I think is something that we need to be cognizant and take note of. But I think what truly stands out, and I think is transformational in this year's budget, is the usage of the word privatization. And I mean by privatization, I'm clubbing divestment or disinvestment together. In fact, after NDA 1, this is under Prime Minister Vajpayee, this is the highest reference to these terms that we have had in the last 20 years. In fact, during both the UPA that we had, UPA governments, we had minimal reference to the terms, and I think that in itself, I think from an institutional point of view, does throw a cautionary tone to the overall assessment that we do for this year's budget. The reason is because it does, while privatization is being seen as a long-term strategy to for future growth or the sale of public assets, etc. The real obstacle, I think, will be in terms of the ground implementation of this. And I think the opposition is not so much from political opposition, or let's say the left-leaning socialist political opposition that the government faces, but I think it will come from the courts of the country. And the reason I mentioned that the courts are a very large part of the implementation problem is because we have very recently seen, just 4 months back in October 2020, that the special CBI court of Jodhpur district in Rajasthan, it has registered a criminal case against the former Union Minister Arun Shourie and the Secretary of Ministry for Divestment of Vajpayee government, that is Mr. Baijal. Now, what truly is an interesting observation at this point is that, there is a criminal conspiracy and cheating has been assumed in the sale of the 2002 sale of this luxury hotel. But what has made this order particularly intriguing is the fact that the CBI had already submitted a closure report of this case some time back, and yet it's back in terms of the actual implementation. So the hesitance or the resistance that we see from the bureaucracy, or that this government is likely to face in terms of its larger divestment or privatization drive, I think is something, it is very important to be cognizant of that impediment. So the courts are truly going to determine whether the privatization, while it is transformational in the speech, will it truly become transformational in terms of actual implementation. The second point, so one was the speech and the privatization push. The second point that I want to highlight is the focus on healthcare. We are in the middle of a pandemic, and we have seen that lack of preparedness or poor infrastructure can truly hold the entire economy at ransom. Now, we have seen that even very well developed, rich, affluent societies of the OECD, which are still grappling with this problem, clearly the infrastructure or healthcare supply is not as much of a problem there. But I think in the Indian case, we have to recognize that what lends additional uncertainty and I think riskiness to the pandemic is the fact that we truly have very limited health infrastructure in the public space. And infectious diseases and of the nature, the contagion, means that there are very many externalities. Private care, though it is 75% of the healthcare sector in India, is still limited in what it can do in a pandemic such as this. Though there is a very large role which is still untapped, not just testing, but actual clinical help, now vaccination, etc. But the heart of such pandemics will fundamentally, depend on how the public care is structured. And towards that, I think the big push that we have seen in terms of raising healthcare spending is largely in that space. But of course, it is not a very, very significant increase, unlike what is popularly believed, because a very large part of the increase in the health budget is really increase in water infrastructure. And while that is a welcome move, but health in itself does remain a sector which is, want of a lot of support. The problem is is it a financing constraint, or is it really an ideas constraint? Meaning, is there a well thought out ask from the health ministry that finance has not fulfilled, or fulfilled partly, or is it a financing constraint? And my belief is that I think our capacity in the healthcare space is limited a lot by the government capacity. If you consider some of our biggest states like UP, Bihar, are all sitting with unspent health budgets. So it's important to appreciate this point that the spending capacity of the government and the states in particular are also going to determine what the total amount that has been allocated to healthcare. So you have to see that in entirety. So those are the 2 points I wanted to highlight as remarks.
Thank you, Professor Shamika. It's very interesting you raised the point that the opposition would probably come from the courts. Our first constitutional amendment itself was in a way forced by court action, because the Jawaharlal Nehru government was very unhappy with the way courts were interfering in the agenda of the government. Now, let's see where we go from here. But welcome, Professor Rao. I'm glad the technical hitch is over. I really wanted you to lay out a sort of a historical perspective quickly on the past fiscal, how the evolution of fiscal policy has happened in India, and also to sort of look at the lens with which this government is looking at some of the, like for example, it's a debt-driven growth strategy, and what is your thoughts on these lens? The relationship, how the government is viewing the relationship between debt and GDP, as the economic survey elaborates. Professor Rao.
Thank you very much. I hope I am able to communicate now. I hope I am audible.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. And my apologies for the technical hitch. I don't know why it happened. Well, much water has flown under the bridge from the time when this automatic monetization of the deficit was happening, and then this was stopped by an agreement between the governor of Reserve Bank and the finance ministry, and this came into effect from 1997. However, taming the deficit has been a major challenge. Taming the deficit and controlling debt has been a major challenge for the governments, successive governments, and there have been all sorts of attempts to do it. In fact, they followed the rule-based fiscal policy, enacted the FRBM Act, and then obviously that didn't succeed very much. They redefined the targets, did creative accounting, including massive off-budget borrowing, and from time to time. So the deficit and debt has always been a problem. Why am I saying this? That's because, you see, now when the economy is slowing down, you want to have a counter-cyclical policy, and you don't have the space. I mean, in fact, you see, if you had followed, austere fiscal policy earlier, you could have really calibrated a counter-cyclical fiscal policy now. But the problem is that pandemic was only a trigger. In fact, the economy has been slowing down even before the pandemic struck. In fact, the growth rate of the economy, which was 8.1% in the fourth quarter of 2017-18, actually declined to 3.1% in the fourth quarter of 2019-20. So there has been a slide. Now when you have this slide, and then when you have an elevated fiscal deficit problem, there is definitely a problem. So counter-cyclical fiscal policy becomes a very difficult situation. When the pandemic struck, economy collapsed, as we all seen. Now the first half of the year, the growth rate contraction is estimated at 15.7%, and not surprisingly, the economic survey makes a passionate plea for the government expenditure to increase. In fact, it's very interesting to see the plea that the argument that the economic survey makes so that the government loosens its purse, and it argues that need to have a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, and it says that when the growth rate is higher than the interest rate, there will not be problem of debt sustainability, and then of course large public spending on infrastructure results in crowding in of private investment rather than crowding out, and therefore there should be government should go about spending much more money. There are some caveats that I need to point out. In a situation where your fiscal deficit now is is estimated at 9.5%, and if you add the off-budget liabilities, and I mean, in fact, that's a good thing that they are phasing out, but for this year there are off-budget liabilities, and if you add that is 21-22, it becomes 10.15%. Now, so you have 9.5% fiscal deficit as counted, and next year it is budgeted at 6.8%. The primary deficit this year is 5.9%. See, this interest rate growth rate differential works to this thing if the primary deficit is 0. Now, if the primary deficit is 5.9% this year and 3.1% this year, I mean, things are not as well this thing. And then there has been a massive indirect monetization through open market operations, more than 3 lakh crores last year. And when you are saying that we are going to borrow 12 lakh crores in the coming year, obviously there will be, there is this indirect, the indirect monetization of the deficits that is taking place. Now, the question is, you can keep the interest rates artificially low by having large open market operations from time to time, and bring down the yield curve so that the government is allowed to borrow at low rates of interest. Now, and then see, this financial repression and this type of doing has its own consequences. I mean, its own distortions. It's not that, see, everything is this is not a simplistic thing that the differential between growth rate and the interest rate is a satisfactory solution for everything. Now, as I said, the low interest rate could be because of the financial depression and it also creates other distortions, including in this country nobody bothers about the depositors. Anyway, that's the interest rate on the deposits. Now, as I said, this budget brings in some 3 important things. One is greater transparency. In fact, to move towards, putting out off-budget liabilities. There is at least the use of the dirty word P, the privatization. There may be implementation problems, but then for the first time they said that there is, privatization is not a taboo. And of course, it gives a lot of reform signals. Again, to what extent they will be able to do it. Now, on the issue Shamika Ravi did make about health sector expenditure. Health is a state subject. 80% of the spending has to come from the states. Now, obviously, there is a certain amount of money which through the urban local body transfers the finance commission had made, given, but that's not very much. So much of the thing has to happen from the states, and somehow or the other, when we discuss about the budget, when almost 65% of the expenditure is incurred at the state level, we always focus on the center. But then I think, much of the health spending will have to come from the states. And of course, they have provided some 35,000 crore for the new vaccine distribution and all that. So as I said, 2/3 of the spending has to come, is at the state level. And so the situation is, well, in 2021-22, again, much of the expenditure that has happened, if you really see closely, much of it has been for, expanding the public distribution system. Part of it is transferring the clearing of the loans of the National Small Saving Fund. So, And if you really take, and then of course some additional money for water supply and sanitation. If you other than that, I mean, in fact, you see the so-called extra spending that comes to somewhere about 2% of GDP. If one looks at it carefully. So it was unavoidable. 9.5% of fiscal deficit was unavoidable. Now the question is, I mean, possibly it may not have much of a serious adverse consequences in 2021-22. We were almost leaving that for the reason that there was a huge output gap, and there is, and obviously the private investment is not taking place, and therefore, heavy borrowing from the market has not really impacted very much. But going further, as the output gap declines, as capacity utilization improves, and as the private investment starts taking, the things can work difficult, and therefore I think the Reserve Bank will have to keep a watch. And obviously this high fiscal deficit is a matter of concern, but possibly in the environment that we are in, this is unavoidable, and that's where I stop.
Thank you, Professor Rao. I'm very glad. Thank you for that wonderful context which you have set. I'm very glad you said that RBI has to watch now, because the next person I'm going to is Dr. Niranjan, and I want him to talk about. So the central banker's language itself is very interesting. Former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan once called an overheating economy, he called it irrational exuberance. Now, his exuberance became exasperation a little while later, and he finally had to admit that it had something to do with his own monetary policy measures which he had taken early on. But the relationship between fiscal policy and monetary policy has of late been in focus. And Dr. Niranjan, could you give your views on that?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you, Dinesh, and thank you to Ambedkar University for inviting me here. So let me start with a broad view that I believe that the coordination between fiscal and monetary policy will be one of the most tricky parts of Indian macro policy in the next 3-4 years. And why am I saying next 3-4 years? That it's not we are going to have elevated fiscal deficits or large public debt to GDP only for this or next. If you see the Finance Commission report, they're basically saying that even at the end of 5 years, public debt to GDP is going to be 85%, which is massive by Indian standards. It's completely off the charts. So I think this coordination between the RBI and the ministry or the government is going to be one of the most tricky tasks in the next 3 to 5 years. If you go back, Dr. Rao mentioned, of course, the automatic monetization and the 1997 agreement to prevent it. But I just want to go to another episode, which was 2009 to 2011, when there was a coordinated fiscal and monetary expansion to deal with the after effects of the financial crisis. And then, if you remember, the RBI took its own time to withdraw monetary accommodation. And later, Dr. B.R. also admitted it. Of course, we are saying this with the benefit of hindsight. He was in the hot seat, so this is not meant as a criticism of Dr. B.R. But if you remember, after that, inflation went out of control, not just headline, but even core inflation. And one thing led to the other. And this played a large part in the 2013 run on the Indian rupee. So I think we have an example from 10 years ago when monetary accommodation continued to be too loose. So now if I just come to the present time and see that over the past year, what has the RBI done? And I'd like to put it into 4 buckets. The first obviously were the rate cuts, right? RBI reduced the repo rate despite inflation being at the upper end or even above its comfort level. The second, there was a large release of liquidity. As Dr. Rao said, partly it was indirect monetization of the deficit because there were OMOs, etc. But even there were long-term repo operations. There was the operation twist to flatten the yield curve, etc. So RBI did, and the CRR cut. So there was a whole bunch of liquidity operations. And if you remember the May 2013, the first Atmanirbhar package, out of those 20 trillion, 10 trillion was what the RBI was doing. So the RBI was leading from the fund to prevent firm failures or to prevent the supply side shock becoming embedded in the system. So that's one. Rate cuts was one. Liquidity operations. Then there was regulatory forbearance, right? So there was the moratorium on interest payments, and now there is restructuring of loans according to Mr. Kamat's committee's recommendation. And the fourth was very strong forward guidance. Even now, the RBI keeps saying that we will ensure ample liquidity. Now, the question is that some of this helped during the pandemic. So the money market rates came down towards where RBI wanted it. Some of the credit spreads, means what state governments or what corporate borrowers borrow above the government borrowing rate, those came down. So the immediate impact was there, but the real elephant in the room is that now what, right? And then this goes into the budget, because even in 2021, which is the year which is ending, the bond market could absorb this large rise in borrowing for two reasons. One is that there was a sudden spike in bank deposits because of either forced savings or precautionary savings, but financial savings economy just shot up. They're about 10% of the GDP. Normally, they went up to almost 20% in those months. So there was a huge inflow of resources into banks, and there was no credit demand from the private sector. So therefore, the banks had the resources to support, the government borrowing, and the RBI also was helping out OMOs. Now, the thing is that this is not going to normalize, right? Because people are not, as the economy comes back to normal, you will see spending go up, the savings behavior normalize, and you will see some pickup in credit demand. It's not yet evident, but nevertheless. So the real pressure will come once private sector credit picks up and the government is sitting with this large borrowing program. And the RBI will then have to figure out a way to accommodate the large borrowing program while ensuring that the private sector is not denied funds. And this is where you're going to come into a problem or a potential problem, because then the RBI will be, in a way, have to make not a choice, but will have to balance between accommodating the government borrowing as the government's banker and meeting its inflation target. It's an inflation targeting bank. So I'm not still sure that we have moved to back to an era of complete fiscal dominance where the borrowing, supporting the fiscal operation has become the primary goal of the RBI. I don't think so. But nevertheless, the RBI's ability to, support the government borrowing program either through OMOs or anything else will affect its monetary operation. And therefore, as I said, the coordination between these two agencies, especially given the fact that the RBI has a formal inflation target now, unlike 2009-10, is going to be a very, very tricky technical problem and a political economy problem. So I think I'll stop here for now, but what the RBI does, my own view is that the RBI will have to at some point of time start holding back at least some of its, I think the interest moratorium is off. So that part of it has been done. I think they're committed to rolling back the 1% CRR cut on the 1st of April. So that will be done. But the real issue then, I don't think there's going to be much action on the the repo rate per se. But the liquidity operation and the forward guidance is going to be very critical. And I'm saying this is not just for a year, but I think we are headed for a longish term of high deficits and public debt.
Thanks, Niranjan. Thanks very much. A longish term of public debt. That's interesting because the RBI is also going to get the new inflation range very soon. so from the government as well. So that's again, I'll continue the same in the same vein about this fiscal and monetary policy balancing with Mr. Barua as well. I mean, a couple of days ago, the British economist Robert Skidelsky called fiscal policy the only game in town, so to say. And he pointed out to the Bank of England Deputy Governor Paul Tucker, commenting that monetary policy should take a backseat to fiscal policy now. And since the buzzword now is counter-cyclical policy, including in the economic survey, as we normalize after the pandemic, could you share your thoughts, Mr. Barua, what's going on?
Yeah, sure. Again, thanks very much for inviting me. I think we are kind of on the same page, singing from the same hymn sheet as far as the potential distortions of over-coordinated fiscal and monetary policy are concerned. And I think even fiscal policy might be the only game in town. But there is the risk of overstimulating the economy. I think there is an active debate going on in the US between a former Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers, and current Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen about the quantum of the stimulus needed and the potential problems that it can breed. And here I see, as both Niranjan and Dr. Rao pointed out, and it also feeds into the fact that that Dr. Ravi mentioned that inflation didn't sort of find a mention in the budget, that if normalization is delayed and there is the RBI is completely focused on managing yields and with its inevitable liquidity consequences, there are distortions both in terms of financial stability and as well as inflation risks that might be bred. There was an attempt to sort of give some guidance towards normalization, I think on the 11th of January, post the budget when the new borrowing numbers were announced. That seems to have been reversed. And I hope we have a move towards normalization, both in terms of now announcing a fiscal glide path, as well as a liquidity glide path, if you like, so that the system does not overheat, given the fact that our potential output might have been severely impacted on by the last few years of declining growth and investments. So that is one thing. Normalization is certainly something that we need to seriously think about and avoid the perils of the distortions associated with overstimulation. As the only sort of banker in this panel, let me just turn to a couple of issues, if I may, on the specifics. Infrastructure was highlighted so much, and it's important to talk about some of the institutional changes that have been announced in trying to promote infrastructure going forward. One of them is, of course, the new development finance institutions. And let me just say at the very outset that I am very I tend to be a little wary of large, these monolithic institutions, which try to do virtually everything, and it has with its associated risks of diseconomies and distortions of scale. But the moot point that I wanted to sort of highlight is that the development financial institution really does issues bonds, raises the funds, and then lends to infrastructure companies and entities that would be sort of involved in that particular area. It's all very fine, but I think the problem, we've had chronic problems of in the bond market, the corporate bond market, the non-government bond market, which need to be addressed. And this is unless those issues, for instance, a well-defined yield curve of which corporate bonds can be priced, mechanisms for managing your risk. For instance, a credit default swap market, which is a fancy way of describing an insurance for product for the bond markets. Unless these develop simultaneously, a development financial institution will have its limitations. So I hope that the process of developing the corporate bond market, which has been tardy for decades now, is not we are not distracted from that process, because unless there is a robust non-government bond market, financial institutions of this kind will not succeed. And of course, there is a need for a large amount of external capital. I hope that the financial institution will work towards creating structures. Will not get, will just put out any structure that they want in the market and hope that external investors will pick them up. There is a need to tailor the instruments through which money would be raised for infrastructure to the risk appetite, to the tenor appetite of external investors. And unless we are thinking of a model by which, again, the DFI goes back to banks and raises money from domestic banks, but actually considers a larger market, then we need to sort of keep this alignment between specific facets of appetite for infrastructure bonds and their supply. Finally, the bad bank issue. As a banker, I think it is a good idea. Again, I would have, as I said, I'm a little wary of large institutions, single monolithic institutions which try to do everything. Maybe our suggestion was to have multiple bad banks, which could well develop. I think one of the success stories of the great financial crisis was the sort of the micro bad banks, if you like. Citibank had its own bad bank, UBS had its own bad bank, and that sort of paid off very well. The problem again is that the bad bank, and I think Dr. Ravi mentioned the kind of interventions that come from courts, the well-known sort of apprehension that public sector managers and government officials have in disposing of assets at certain valuations. So ultimately, the bad bank is really a portfolio manager, and the portfolio manager would have to be empowered to gauge what appetite and price the market has for the asset, for the distressed asset, and the price it's willing to pay. But if it is in constant dread of the fact that at 10 years, 15 years down the road, it's going to be hauled up in court and be asked to explain why exactly it is they did what they did, then I think that there's going to be a problem. So I think it requires a very large, mindset change, especially among the public sector banks, where and the assurance from the government that these risks, which public sector managers see for themselves, and not just in the near term, but over potentially 10 years, 15 years later, these are mitigated to some extent. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mr. Barua. The courts seem to be looming large over all of us these days, and even quasi-judicial forum like the IBC remains on ice, even though we are setting up a bad bank. So it's quite interesting the route which we are taking to solve these problems. I'd go back to Dr. Niranjan. Do you see shades of MMT thinking, modern monetary theory thinking in the budget and the survey. And do you think it's a good idea to frame MMT-based policies for India? I also ask this because there is a political ideological context to it as far as the ruling party is concerned, because their ideological, their ideologue, Deen Dayal Upadhyaya, for instance, had talked about full employment for everybody. So, Dr. Niranjan.
Yeah, thanks. Now that's a sort of a pretty big question. So first, I'll just take whether the budget and the economic survey has MMT sort of flavor to it, and then whether MMT is a good idea for India. So I think a lot of when people say that there's a MMT angle to the economic survey, I think it's largely based on the chapter which argues that till your rate of your interest cost is lower than your rate of growth in nominal terms, then you're fine, So the basically that the government's budget constraint is, not as serious as you think it is. Now, I don't think that's exactly the MMT view. The MMT view is that a government which prints its own money and which borrows domestically only has no financial constraints, that only it has real constraints. So I wouldn't go so far as to say this. And even that argument, it's not exactly an MMT argument that R should be less than G. I think it's been there in, we shouldn't say this in front of somebody of the eminence of Dr. Govinda Rao. I mean, he's a better judge, but it's been there in the lot of debt sustainability analysis, that, and the tricky part is that there's also a third variable in those calculations, which is the primary deficit. You see, so you always assume that this is, works when the primary deficit is at zero or you have a primary surplus. I think that has. So I do not see a strong MMT angle to the budget or this thing. I'm not completely against the need to expand the fiscal spending right now. There are reasons. I don't want to go into that because that goes into another direction. About MMT's applicability to India, I have my doubts, right? Because first is MMT, it's based on this idea of monetary sovereignty, that a country which has no it borrows only in its own currency, and which has a sovereign currency that can be freed from this budget constraint. Now there are two issues here. One is that if you think of this in an open economy framework, not in a closed economy, which India is, it is an open economy, then we do borrow from the rest of the world, right? So we are not like the US. So we have a balance of payments constraint. So even if you assume for the domestic economy, there is, monetary expansion will not necessarily be inflationary. I don't believe that. You still have a balance of payments issue. The US prints its own money to fund its current account deficit. India doesn't, right? Nobody wants to hold the Indian rupee as for their foreign exchange transactions. So that's one, that India doesn't fit into the monetary sovereignty sort of hit. The second is MMT says that as you said, that employment should be the final thing, that you should aim for full employment. My understanding is that this applies to advanced countries which are seeing cyclical unemployment, right? Largely, when there are aggregate demand issues and there is unemployment, then that should be the fundamental task of your fiscal and monetary policy. In India, unemployment, there is cyclical unemployment, but there is also structural unemployment, disguised unemployment. So the maximizing employment means what? It's not very clear. You can maximize employment through NREG if you want to, but so I am a little skeptical. I think the MMT argument, if at all it is relevant, it is relevant to countries of a different structure and different system, not to India. And whether has played a big part in this budget, I really doubt it.
Thank you, Niranjan. I'm going back to Professor Rao now. Professor Rai, I want you to talk a little bit about the Finance Commission Award. And you already mentioned about resource sharing, especially when it comes to the health sector. 80% of the expenditure comes from the states. And you know, you once said that never in history has the TOR itself clearly nudged the commission to give less to the states, in fact. And I also would like you to talk about the Defense and Internal Security Fund, which again shrinks the pool. Could you, Professor Rao?
Thank you. Well, this is since the discussion has been mostly on the budget, this is in a sense a sort of diversion, but that's fine. I mean, everything is related to public finance anyway. As I mentioned, almost 2/3 of the expenditures are incurred at the state level, but then they don't have revenue, substantial revenue handles, particularly after they gave all the domestic trade taxes to merge with the goods and services tax. So they gave up the fiscal autonomy in favor of tax harmonization. Let me put it this way. Well, I mean, they may regret it in some ways, but nevertheless, the point is that when you don't really have that, obviously the constitutional mechanism is to, there is a constitutional mechanism to offset the vertical and horizontal imbalance between the revenues and expenditures. And so the Finance Commission, to be appointed by the President every 5 years, is the solution to the problem. Finance Commission is required to give, required to recommend devolution of the central taxes to the states, what is called the divisible pool, and the divisible pool comprises of the gross tax revenue of the center minus the cost of tax collection minus the revenue from cesses and surcharges. So from that divisible pool, the money is, the Finance Commission is, asked to make a recommendation on the transfer of, that has to be shared so that these vertical and horizontal imbalances are resolved. Now, this Finance Commission had a number of, it started in a wrong note in the sense that the terms of reference had, attracted a large number of criticisms. I will not go into the details of that because I had written elsewhere on this thing, and there is no point in going back to them. There were lots of apprehensions. One of the interesting things is that Finance Commission is supposed to have a uniform approach between the union and the states, and in affecting the balance. And when the terms of reference says that you take into consideration the some of the populist measures of the states, then the question comes in: what happens to the populist measures of the center? There are issues of that nature, and that is the reason why late Guhan, Tamil Nadu economist turned IAS officer turned economist, used to say that the Finance Commissions bark at the center, but they bite the states. I mean, this is a sort of a canine explanation that he used to give to the Finance Commission's approach to things, because they can only say some things about the center, but when it comes to the states, they can actually, while making the assessment, they need not include, just as the loan waivers on many of these populist measures don't get included in the assessment of expenditures. So one had feared a lot, but then thankfully the Finance Commission kept up the spirit, and then it said that 41% of the divisible pool should be shared, and the formula for sharing was the same as the one which it gave in the first report, for 2020-21. And they said that this 41% is equivalent to 42% which the 14th Finance Commission had given, because that 1% additional was the money that was claimed by Jammu and Kashmir, and Jammu and Kashmir no longer is a state and it is a union territory. So this sharing is done only between the states and not union territory. Now, Finance Commission also has given revenue deficit grants. Now the revenue deficit grants comes like this. You see, you make a normative assessment of expenditures of the state, normative assessment of the revenues of the states, and then, on the basis of your formula, work out the projected tax devolution. And whatever, if there is a post-devolution deficit, that is given as a revenue deficit grant. So there was in the term of reference, there was a statement saying that Commission may consider whether revenue deficit grant should be given at all. Now the question is, so they went about giving the grants, but at the same time, what they've done is, by the end of the period, that 2025-26, there is no revenue deficit grant. In fact, they've given the time for the state to phase it out, so that by the end, you don't have the revenue deficit grant, but there is revenue deficit grant. And states like Kerala, or West Bengal, with the large interest payments because of the past sins that they have committed, have the time to adjust. But what happens later on, obviously the grants will not be given to them for that purpose, because the Finance Commission, the government will follow strictly the Finance Commission's recommendation. Now, this is the crux of the thing. There are other thing is that the Finance Commissions are also required to, recommend measures to augment the consolidated funds of the states, to supplement the resources of the local bodies based on the recommendations of the State Finance Commission. Now, State Finance Commission have been dysfunctional in many parts of the country. Now, what these people have done is, they have said that they have given the recommendation, grants. They have recommended the grants, but they have made it, some of them is in the urban local bodies for health purposes, for augment the health centers. Now, in doing that, what these people have done is that there is an entry-level condition they are putting, namely that the states have to appoint the state finance commissions in the urban local bodies, and then they have to finalize their accounts, and then they get it audited, and then and the third thing is that they have to reform the property taxes. Now the problem is not with the conditions. I think they are all very laudable, but what we have done is we have put the conditions on the states for getting the money to the local bodies. What interest the states would have to get the, to allow the local bodies to get the money. In fact, you see, this used to happen in the 13th Finance Commission. There were a series of 9 conditions were put in to the states. States didn't fulfill any of them, except in the case of Kerala, which all the conditions were based on the Kerala model. So rest of the states didn't get that money. Rest of the local bodies didn't get the money. State doesn't get to penalize for not doing its job. And actually, it is the responsibility of the governor of a state to appoint the State Finance Commission. If the states don't do it, governor should remind the state, governor should remind the state government to do that. But anyway, that's a different thing. The commission has also recommended several sectoral grants, and including a separate grant for the health sector. This is very important. And what has happened is, there quite a bit of money they have recommended, but the Union Ministry, the Finance Ministry has said in its action taken report that, see, since we are already having various centrally sponsored schemes, we will basically consider them along with those things. So which basically means they have not accepted those recommendations. And there are 1 or 2 other things that I want to see. Much of whatever the Finance Commission does gets negated over a period of time, and this gets negated. Last time when the 14th Finance Commission came, there were 2 sets of things that happened. One is the union government went on increasing the cesses and surcharges, which are not shareable with the states. So what has happened now? What happened was that, you see, in 2019-20, the tax devolution constituted 32.4% of the gross tax revenue, even though it's 32.4%. In 2020-21, it became 28.9%, and in 21-22, estimated is 30%, because all the increase in the petroleum taxes and things like that were all by way of surcharges, and obviously you deny this thing. And all the previous commissions have adversely commented on this type of development, but 15th Finance Commission has not said a word on that. There is other thing that they did is, for the centrally sponsored schemes, they so-called rationalize them, reduce the number of, and then convert them into 29 umbrella schemes. And within that, they said that the share of the states, goes up in the specific purpose matching transfers. Anyway, these are the two things done. So similarly, in this budget itself, they have imposed the cess, which would reduce the share of the states. The other thing is this defense and internal security fund, which you have mentioned. And what they have done, what the government what the Finance Commission has done is to say that, over a period of 5 years, the government should contribute 2,38,354 crores as from the consolidated fund to this thing. I'm sorry, it should have total size of 2,38,000 crore. The consolidated fund should give 1,53,000 crore, and the other three things are proceeds from the divestment of public sector, defense public sector enterprises, and then monetization of surplus land, including those from the state to given to the states, and then in the future, whenever there is a requirement by the states, when you give it to them, they monetize that. Well, now the government has accepted and said it is going to work out the modalities, and we will have to see. One of the things that before I close, I want to say is, it has given a very relaxed fiscal target to the government. We have been talking about, concern. Niranjan talked about, the 2-3 years of problem that we are going to have. Now, fiscal deficit, it has given 3 alternative scenarios, but the one which is a middle scenario is that they had assumed that in 2021-22, the fiscal deficit will be 6%, and it would come down to something like 4% by the end of by 25-26. And for the state, they said that it will from 4% of fiscal deficit, and it will come down to somewhere 3.5% by 2022-23, and 3% by 23-24, and thereafter would remain at that level. And similarly, the debt should come down from 89.8% to 85.7% by 2025-26, out of which center's share is 62.9 to 56.6, and states 31.1 to 30.5. And these are the target. And the finance ministry, government finance minister has not accepted, has accepted the recommendations for the states, but not accepted it for the center, because while giving the budget speech itself, she said by 25-26 she would have a fiscal deficit of 4.5%. No, these are some of the broad things that have happened, and I think we are going to be having quite an interesting time discussing these issues in the future.
Thank you, Professor Rao. I'm sorry I veered off a little bit from the budget, but this was the first budget after the Finance Commission report came. I thought it was quite important because it incorporated it has to incorporate its suggestions in it. A few days ago, Niranjan tweeted a very interesting tweet, which was quoting Daniel Moynihan, who was the US ambassador to India in 1977. And I quote what he said, that what does India export but communicable diseases, end quote. And he juxtaposed it with another from Wall Street Journal, a more contemporary story, which said India has emerged as a leader in vaccine diplomacy. Now that's quite a swing, I must say. We have traveled in healthcare. And Professor Shamika, I'm coming back to you. You also mentioned that recently that the COVID-19 probably could be our Y2K moment, and it could act to the healthcare sector as Y2K did to the IT sector. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. So Dinesh, I've been writing on this with the view, and I firmly do believe in it, that with the global economy aging, particularly the affluent part of the globe, and health costs increasing amongst all developed and many parts of the developing markets, health will become a very strategic and sort of a future source of growth for countries that are prepared with solutions. Many countries are looking to lower their costs, healthcare costs, by looking for basically cheaper manpower, so nurses and doctors, etc. And I think on that front, we have a distinction. I would though dub it as also a dubious distinction, because it is coming at the cost of our own, healthcare worker to citizen ratio. It's quite adverse. But nonetheless, we do have the manpower. The second is the health IT support. Health IT also is a very specialized area where a lot of this is the whole AI space, and there is a lot of innovation happening to cut the health costs, etc. Now, a country like India, just like IT became the engine of growth over the last 30 years, because I think with or without government support, and many will argue it was without government support, the IT sector had made the underlying investments, and they were prepared to seize this growth in these opportunities that emerged globally, and it became an engine of India's growth. I think similarly, the current situation with the pandemic and the global demand for vaccines, and the fact that we do have the capacity to manufacture at very large scale with the kind of international tie-ups that we have, etc. I think the whole logistic, if you look at the supply chain, beyond just vaccine, it is really an extension of the larger pharma sector, and particularly the generic part of it. I think India, if we do make the necessary investments in healthcare, then these are all the right indications that perhaps for the next 50 years, healthcare can become our engine of growth the way IT was for the last 30 years. But that will necessarily...
Yeah, so what I was asking is that in the current budget and the policies which have been laid out in the past 1 year, do you see the building blocks of this?
Some of it, yes, Dinesh. Some of it, yes, because I think there is a recognition that health R&D will require state support. And towards that, you are seeing that there has been an allocation and an endeavor to sort of strengthen that. Yeah. But a large part of our health, and Professor Rao mentioned this, that the state center, if you look at the distinction, just the division of the overall finances, the problem is, you have a DGHS which is led by the state or at the state level, and then you have a national health mission, which is from the center level. And there are right now two parallel systems, and therefore we all understand diseconomies of scale. Currently, the increase in the health allocation that has happened is also, it's sort of strengthening the NHM further. So we will see that states, central spending in the states, on health will increase. But I think, we do realize that in many of the most backward states, we still have unspent money there. And that for me is the biggest cause of concern, because clearly financing is not our limiting constraint here. It is more the government capacity, in the healthcare sector is the limiting constraint. And that is not going to be easy to circumvent or overcome by mere allocation in budget right now. Now, think of the fact that, and also I think there is the current pandemic has also a distinction where it has come out as an open glaring one, is COVID has largely been an urban health problem. It has moved to the rural areas, etc. But the bulk of the burden has been in the urban areas. But do you know that as far as expectation or building of public health infrastructure is concerned, whether it is primary health center, community health center, sub-centers, etc., we have very well-defined population benchmark for rural areas, but we don't have any such benchmark for urban areas. Now that just gives you a sense of, financing is a constraint, all right, but it is not our big constraint. Health ministry has to do a lot more work, beginning with simple things like definitions, to really bolster, the public health infrastructure in the country so that we are better prepared for the next round.
Right. Thank you. Thanks for that. Mr. Barua, I'm coming back to you, and I want a little bit more. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the kind of risks that could develop? We all mentioned inflation, but we really did not get into the nitty-gritties of how it could affect the corporate sector, especially with the heavy borrowing program of the government, and how is the corporate sector preparing to mitigate this risk, if it is?
Well, at the moment, I think the corporate sector is reasonably pleased with the fact that the government has not gone in for aggressive fiscal consolidation, which would have hurt growth possibilities and ultimately feed through to their profits and profitability, and of course, before that, hurt their top line growth. I think corporates are beginning to see, and one of the interesting things that is, if you just look at the RBI intervention through open market operations and so forth, it is concentrated in certain segments of the yield curve, particularly the long-term, long tenors and the benchmark bond, which is the 10-year bond. If you look at the rest of the curve, and that gives you an idea of where the market really sees interest rates, those tenors have seen significant increase in yields. So the corporate sector is beginning to fret a little bit about a potential rise in interest rates, although given the fact that credit demand's still weak, the credit deposit ratio is still very low, it's not really being that aggressively transmitted to them, but they've seen some of the impact on the corporate, for instance, the commercial paper market, some of the shorter term loans. And I think there is some apprehension that it will slowly filter through to other loans as well. The general expectation is that the increases are not going to be that much. And broadly, I think the corporate sector, if you can sort of describe it as some kind of a homogeneous whole, believes that some kind of automatic normalization is to be expected when fundamentals have changed, and indeed, at least for the larger corporate sector, or even the larger companies within the very broad catchment of the SME segment, they have seen an improvement in both sales as well as profits. I think there are problems coming from the commodity market side, where we've seen international prices moving up. Oil is an obvious example, but you see other things like metals and so forth, which are moving up. So there is some concern about that. And if you sort of want to sort of see it within sort of the broader rubric of the distortions caused by excessive stimulus, I think the commodity price increase is really a function of global central banks, particularly the G7 central banks, led by the US Fed, doing monetary policy on steroids, because that's leading to commodity prices rising. It's leading to perverse incentives in their own equity markets. It's spilling over to emerging markets and so forth. As of now, I don't think the corporate sector is particularly concerned about some of the risks that we discussed earlier. I think it is comfortable with the fact that it isn't saddled with aggressive fiscal consolidation. I think the corporate sector is happy with the fact that there seems to be a recovery which is well underway, and I think the general hope is that it'll sustain. In banking, for instance, there is some cheer that the kind of NPL numbers that one had expected around this time really haven't materialized, and that banks would correlate with the improvement in economic activity. But I think there are some concerns clearly. One is, of course, the fact that some of the laggard sectors, like civil aviation, tourism, hospitality, etc., they haven't been given any support, and that is one form of this cliched K-shaped recovery that is taking place. I think there is there is concern that perhaps the smaller companies, the really small companies within the SME sector, could have done with some fiscal support. Otherwise, again, it sort of leads to inequalities in corporate recovery. And I think for people who are exposed to the consumption cycle, perhaps some amount of direct cash transfers or fiscal support directly into the hands of the really sort of badly vulnerable and badly affected, instead of just hoping for growth through infrastructure to do the trick, has perhaps disappointed some, and they see that as a long-term issue for consumer demand going forward.
Right. Professor Bhanumurthy has switched on his camera, so I guess, are you saying something, Professor Bhanumurthy? We are already over time, the original time allotted, and if everybody agrees, we can probably extend it for 10-15 minutes, if that's okay.
Sure.
Or shall we take questions? Professor Bhanumurthy, what should?
Yeah, either way is fine. We can, if everybody agrees, we can extend by 10-15 minutes. I think then we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll just ask one question, which has been, which none of us really picked up so far, which is about protectionism. Now, one of the things which the budget, the medium-term fiscal statement mentioned, is that it has raised duties on 4,000 products over the past, 4,000 categories over the past 6 years. And Nirmala Sitharaman clearly stated that this is going to be a very clear strategy. There is a review happening of all the customs tariffs which are remaining, and more is on the way. Professor Rao, the Atmanirbhar initiative itself seems to be behind these walls which we are erecting of protectionism. What do you think?
Sorry, was the question for me? My system went off.
Yes, I was asking you about the customs tariff reduction, this walls we are creating.
Yeah, no, in fact, that's one of the most disappointing things in this budget, which is otherwise, in fact, otherwise a good budget given the circumstances, with all the apprehension that we talked about. You see, from 3-4 years ago, they have started this, erecting this, going back to the 91 type of situation, and becoming more and more protectionist policies. And that's not going to help us. And, that's one of the major issues. And again, it's not, sort of selectively you keep, sort of picking up and then, saying that I will remove the exemptions. And then they have threatened that, they're going to review the exemptions of several items as we go along. So by October or so. Now, that is one of the fears that one has, because it's only by opening up the economy that both the imports and exports grew up, and then obviously our share of our exports in GDP went up very sharply. But now, the things are becoming difficult and the share is coming down, and that's one of the major problems. And in the name of Atmanirbhar, you become protectionist and you create inefficient system. And that's one of the major concerns that I have. I do hope. Our attempt to, with all the discussions and the debate that we had and the negotiations we had, we did not join the RCEP, and there obviously we lost out. Even though by saying that it's a strategic thing, whatever be the case, At the end of the day, you see, you can't be cutting your nose to spike somebody else. That's where the problem is. And
Right.
our that favored treaty with United States has also been on the limbo. Hopefully, with the new administration, they will start doing things. But and there seems to be a strong lobby for more and more protectionism, and getting into you see, instead of erecting a wall, you are erecting scaffolding by saying that I will have a PLI for here, there and everything. And that's not the way I think we should move. We should really start dismantling the protectionism, and I hope some wisdom will dawn, and they will do it.
Thank you, Professor Rao. I think the minister, the junior minister, said in Parliament that we are not currently discussing an FTA with the US. So I think that is out of the window at the moment, at least. Dr. Niranjan, I'm putting the same question to you as well. What is the implication of this, especially because many trade economists are also saying that it's going to hurt our competitiveness more than in the long term. It is going to hurt our competitiveness more than it's making us self-reliant. Could you see?
Yeah, so I broadly share Dr. Rao's concerns that this should not be a slide towards protectionism. Interestingly, the Prime Minister himself has maintained what I would call strategic ambiguity about Atmanirbhar. Actually, in the sense that there's also a thing that we want to enter a global supply chain. So how do you build these tariff walls and enter global supply chain? I'm not dismissing it. There may be these trade-offs, but I'm not. I think that's there's a sort of inherent tension in this. Also, the rate at which tariffs are being increased, right? So, if you remember the trade reforms which Dr. Chelaya committee, it had a clear path, of why we are going down this way. That first, intermediate goods, capital goods, final consumption goods. It had thought through the entire process. I think we have to be very careful, that if we could end up with, even besides the general protectionism issue, we could end up with inverted duty structures, etc. And see, it's very difficult in a system of value chains to understand the long-term implications. So I'll give you one example. Like take computers, right? Now, computers we would classify perhaps as final consumption goods in our lives. But if you remember, if you read the story of Infosys, to import one computer was such a big problem that it almost held back. So, the lack of access to computers held back India's software industry. So we don't know in a dynamic world that today, if because of a PLI, if you are, putting protection of some industry, and that leads to higher domestic prices and therefore gets into higher input costs for another industry which is export oriented. So in a complex economy, I'm very concerned, right? I'm not dismissing anything. I'm not a trade economist, but I just feel that in a system where production is saturated across the world, you have to be very, very careful, and it could lead to a loss of competitiveness in ways you cannot even predict in the next 10 years.
Dinesh, if I may add
Right. Yeah, please.
This is, with regard to what we consider as strategic sector for us, particularly from an employment point of view, which is the apparel sector. Over the last 15 years at least, we have seen multiple attempts at trying to come up with a new strategy to compete with countries like, let's say, Bangladesh and Vietnam. And of course, the import duties, etc., they are a part of the concern. But one of the points which we need to highlight repeatedly is the fact that all these smaller countries have been able to enter trade agreements with large markets. So Bangladesh has a trade agreement with the European Union. Vietnam has a trade agreement with the US. You know, unfortunately, in the Indian case, one is, of course, right now, the kind of import policies, etc., that are being constructed. But more importantly, the fact that we are not able to convert after decades of negotiations certain trade agreements. I think that, again, going back to government capacity, I think it's a very, very big problem that we are dealing with.
Dinesh, may I come in on this? And
Yes, please.
yeah, I
Yes,
just wanted to
please.
make a point which is perhaps a bit of a digression from what we're discussing, but it relates to trade. And I read a lot of the academic and research literature on supply chains. And I mean, I think what the sort of the pandemic has raised as a critical risk is an increasing um move towards deglobalization and more localization of manufacturing because of the kind of risks that associated, with a large shock like this, with the
Right.
very dispersed, diverse global supply chains that we had. And I think, to get back to Dr. Ravi's point, the only in these localized, if indeed manufacturing becomes much more localized, the only way to get a piece of the action is to have, to be part of a block, which is sort of seen as, a critical component of these various kind of localized manufacturing blocks. So let's not, we are not perhaps going back to fully globalized world where again we need to sort of get out the parameters of competitiveness right. We are possibly going transitioning to a very different kind of world of manufacturing and services, and there I think the only game in town is to be part of some kind of a trade alliance.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dinesh, I just want to
Yes.
want to say,
Yes, sir.
no, it's important to have get into trade alliance, as Ambedkar was said. We do need to have trade alliances. That is, in that context, I think not joining the CEP is a disappointment in that sense. But more importantly, pandemic is only a last year's creation. Our attempt at becoming protectionist has started 3 years ago. And there is no point in, we are basically looking back. And that is a worry. And then there is no, as Niranjan said, there is no strategic thinking, and we don't know, how this is going to impact, because, you increase, you reduce the tariffs on the inputs and increase it on the outputs. The effective rate of protection goes up enormously. So you don't really look at the entire details of the effective rate of protection. So suddenly you say that I will have a cess on several items. And there is, and then of course there is somebody who is coming up and saying that I want to increase the import tariffs because I want more revenue. And there are all sorts of noises that is happening. And I think there needs to be a much clearer thinking by the government on this and where we really want to move.
Right. Thank you, Professor Rao. I think all of this is whatever the government is doing, all of us are doing is for the future generations. And I want to read out something which the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report of 2021 said. It said that they're creating a doubly disrupted generation, which I thought was a very powerful phrase, and where there is going to be youth disillusionment as well as an employment ice age. So if these two are going to be the consequences of the current policies, well, God save us. But I think our 15 minutes also is over. So we will conclude this here. Professor Bhanumurthy, do we have questions? Bipin, do we have questions?
I think we can skip those. Yeah, given the time constraint, we can skip those questions, I guess. We have well exceeded the questions. Yeah, maybe I shall send these questions directly to, one is on modern monetary theory and other one is on the disinvestment piece. Maybe, I shall raise the question directly. It is coming from our students, so we can address it.
Sure. I'm sure that panelists wouldn't mind taking them on email or something like that. I mean,
Sure.
It will help the students. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand it over to Bipin for the concluding remarks. Thank you, Professor Rao. Thank you, Professor Shamika. Thank you, Dr. Niranjan, and thank you, Mr. Barua, from my side. It was a wonderful discussion here.
No,
And
thanks
thank you for
to
inviting me here at Base University, Professor Bhanumurthy. And
thanks
thank you very much for the support.
Yeah, thanks to Bhanumurthy and Base University for inviting me, and I couldn't because of the disruption that happened with my technology. I couldn't say that. I'm grateful to for the invitation, and of course, any question that comes, we'll be happy to answer.
Sir, my personal thanks to you, sir.
Bipin?
We had a very fruitful session which discussed a much larger picture covering the Union Budget, Economic Survey, 15 Finance Commission, and the RBI Monetary Policy Review. I'd like to thank all the participants for attending this meeting and sharing the Base University events with your colleagues and your peers. We had people from various fronts attending this session, apart from our students. And I thank Dr. K.V. Raju, Dr. M.R. Narayana, and Dr. S. Bisalaya for accepting our special invite. Professor M. Govindarao never ceases to amaze when he is talking on the policy front. And today was no exception. And he beautifully connected the fiscal status and the impact of the pandemic on economy. I cannot think about anybody else who can talk in detail about how the Finance Commission works and the never-ending state versus center debate in sharing the grants. Thank you, Professor Govindarao, for that enlightening talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dr. Niranjan spoke in detail regarding the government and the RBI coordination and how it is going to play out in the coming years and the challenges that the RBI might face as the economy is going to march ahead. Also, it was especially interesting to listen to his take on the MMT, which is the talk of the town, and I'm sure our students have several questions on the MMT part. Thank you, Dr. Niranjan.
Thank you.
Then we had some wonderful analysis based on the past budget speeches by Dr. Shamika. Those who follow you religiously in Twitter for the COVID graphs didn't get to see your graphs, but it was explained very well. And she also highlighted the need to invest in the healthcare sector, which could fuel the next growth phase like how IT did a few years, a decade or two back for us. So that's something that we need to watch out for. Thank you, Dr. Shamika, for that captivating talk. We had Dr. Abid Barua speaking on the need for the fiscal policy to stimulate the economy, and especially without overheating. He also highlighted the need to address the issues in the corporate bond market, which before we actually come up with the development financial institutions. Of course, we all know that India do not have a vibrant corporate debt market. And we also talk about the bad bank. And I think a suggestion of making this bad bank as an empowered portfolio manager is noteworthy. Thank you, Dr. Abid, for these comments. And importantly, I thank Dinesh Narayan for moderating this panel discussion. He ensured that the discussion is not just limited to the budget numbers, but conveyed a much bigger picture on government, governance, and the society. Thank you, Dinesh, for agreeing to do this.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, coordinating this event. And we expect all your support for the upcoming events by Base University. The next event is exclusively for the students, so we are not highlighting it right now. With all those words, I'm concluding this session. I hope to see you all for the next event. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.